Again, it's good to be able to come here with you as we discuss and study the book of Hebrews. The book of Hebrews is a marvelous book. It has a number of many deep truths in it, and truths that we need to thoroughly understand, because it will certainly deepen our understanding and deepen our appreciation of what we have in the new covenant. Matter of fact, that's kind of the theme of the book. It's the superiority of Christ over everyone and everything that's gone on before. And so if we really understand this, then we will not want to leave Christ and his covenant and his commands for anything else on the earth, because Christ is far superior to everything. I'll try to study this as briefly as possible. I will not be looking at every verse in detail, but we'll try to cover the deeper truths and get on through this book without spending a whole lot of extra time on it, at least. In this first video, I want to first discuss just briefly about the introduction. The introduction of this book is pretty easy because we do not know much about it. We do not know to whom the book was written, although I think it's fairly clear from all the Jewish references and to the Jewish history that it's written to Jewish Christians, but we do not know exactly where it's written. We do not know exactly from where it was written, and certainly we do not know who wrote it. The traditional approach has been that Paul wrote the book of Hebrews, but probably in today's modern world, most people would not say Paul wrote it. So the main reason I think why people might not say Paul wrote it is basically because of two reasons. One is that Paul always added a salutation. He always gave a greeting and talked about sends greetings from other people in all his epistles. But that is not found in the book of Hebrews. Paul never identifies himself as the author like he does in all his other books. But then also in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 17, Paul there said, "The salutation of Paul with my own hand, which is a sign in every epistle, so I write." Notice there Paul says that in every epistle that he wrote, he signed it with his own hand. Well, that is not found in Hebrews. And so for those reasons, maybe others, but those are the main ones, most people today would not say Paul wrote it. But as far as who did write it, we really have no idea. There have been a number of different suggestions, and so I don't going to spend time looking at those because, like I said, we have really no idea who wrote it, and it's not really important. The truth is the same, and that's the important thing here. So I want to point out one of the key words in Hebrews is the word better. 12 times throughout the book of Hebrews, the word better is used. And so we want you to notice that as we go through. We also want to look at maybe the outline. I'm not going to try to outline the book of Hebrews or anything like that, but I want to point out one thing, that the book of Hebrews follows a certain pattern. They will give a section of teaching. We might call it a theological section. And then that is immediately followed by a few verses of application, usually introduced by the word therefore. So when you see the word therefore, which you'll see quite a bit throughout the Hebrews, you get the idea then that this is a section of application. Based on what's just been said, this is what we need to do. And so I think we need to notice that as we go through. It helps you follow it, and you'll see the pattern of this as we go through. So now very briefly, let's get started in the first chapter. Now I'm not going to take time to read every verse, but hopefully you can follow me along as we discuss the various verses, and certainly I will tell you what verse I am talking about. In the first 3 verses, we find a brief introduction about Christ, showing his superiority over everything that's been done before. It starts out in the book of Hebrews, the very first chapter, points out that God is basically the author. Because God at various times and in various ways spoke in times past to the fathers. Here he's pointing out that in the Old Testament time period, God has revealed his will to man in various ways. All of this was incomplete. The message was never intended to be complete back in those days. But God spoke in different ways. He spoke in different people. But every revelation was incomplete. God has never completely revealed his will to any one person. But notice he starts out in verse 2 then with the word but. But again, times past, he did this. But now in the last days, he's spoken to us by his Son. And then he begins to point out some characteristics of his Son, of course, which is Jesus. He gives us 7 characteristics of Jesus. And we see the superiority of Christ over all the prophets. The first one is that Jesus is the heir of all things. The word heir suggests dignity and dominion as the Son. And notice he was appointed heir by God. This book is not anti-Christian or saying the previous words are bad, but that Christ is much superior. Christ is much superior over everything else because he's the last and ultimate word. He's the heir of everything. Not only that, but Christ also created the world. You think about John 1 verse 3. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then verse 3 points out that by him was all things created, and without him was not anything made that was made. So Jesus is the creator of the world. He created both the physical and the spiritual worlds. And of course, this is clear proof for the deity of Christ, since only God can create, Colossians 1 and verse 16. So only God can create. If Jesus is the creator, then that means Jesus must be part of the Godhead. And then in verse 3, we find the third characteristic. Christ is the brightness of the glory of God. The word brightness is only used here in the New Testament. And it properly means a reflected brightness. It's like the beam of a light coming from a flashlight. But it's not the flashlight itself, but it's the light coming from the flashlight. So Christ then is the full manifestation of God. Thus Jesus could say, when you've seen me, you've seen God, because he's the full manifestation of God. We see this exhibited in the Transfiguration. But the purpose here is not to show God's relationship to Jesus, but rather that God communicates to man through his Son, Jesus. And then the fourth characteristic, Christ is the express image of God. The words express image comes from one single Greek word, and it's nowhere else used in the New Testament. It literally denotes an impression an engraving tool makes. The example would be if you had a leather belt or some piece of leather and you want to make some type of imprint on it. Well, you would have a metal imprint and you put that on the leather piece itself. Then you'd hit it very firmly with a hammer or something like that. And it would make an imprint on that piece of leather. That imprint would be exactly like the imprint that you had on the piece of metal. Well, that's what Christ is. Christ is the exact image of the substance or the essence of God. He is not exactly the same as God because it's different, but he's exactly like God. In other words, the things that make God, God, is also true of Jesus. The deity is part of his real nature. Now, since Christ is the essence of God, he cannot be a created being like Jehovah's Witnesses might try to have you believe, because he must be eternal. If he's just like God, then he's eternal. He has to be eternal, or he would not be like God. Now, that also points out that all the various doctrines about Christ became God at his baptism, or Christ ceased being God at his death, or any things like that cannot be true. If you are God, you are always God. You cannot stop being God. And if you're not God, you cannot start being God. You understand? For like I said, if you're eternal, then you must always be here. If you're not eternal, then you can never be like God, because one of the characteristics of deity is that you are eternal. So this points out then, the full deity of Christ. Then the fifth thing is that Christ upholds all things by his power. The word uphold means to carry or support. He made the worlds, and by his power the world is preserved from running into confusion. In other words, he upholds the world. He keeps it running. Now, if Christ was not God, then obviously he could not accomplish that. The sixth thing is that Christ purged our sins. This is something that's been done for all time, and it was done without the aid of any other power. Obviously, this refers to the atonement, which came by the death on the cross. Paul here includes the cross as one of the greatest glories of Christ. Christ has purified our souls by forgiving us of our sins. And that single act on the cross was the means by which he purified our souls. And then the seventh thing, we find that Christ is now sitting at the right hand of God. This goes back to Psalm 110 and verse 1. This expresses the greatness and the dignity of God. The one who humbled himself to die on the cross has now been exalted above all power and all dominion. He is now sitting at the right hand of God, which is the place of high honor, power, and dignity. The word sitting denotes continuance. This is something that's going to continue forever and forever. And he is sitting in contrast to the Hebrew priest, because the work of the Hebrew priest was never finished. We will look at this a little more as we get to the priesthood of the Old Testament later. So we see seven things here that Paul, the writer of Hebrews, mentions in regard to superiority of Christ over the prophets that's gone before. Now through verse 14, or the end of the rest of the chapter, the writer of Hebrews emphasizes the superiority of Christ over the angels. Now, some people think that there may have been some type of practice of angel worship going on in the first century. There's no mention of that, and it's unlikely, I think, that that was true. But probably very likely they did think angels were very important beings, although not necessarily would they be worshiping them. But in today's modern world, we're almost to the point where we're worshiping angels. There seems to be a certain fascination with angels. And so many times people exalt angels far more than what they should be exalted, because angels were simply servants of God. They're not like God, they're simply servants of God, just as we're servants of God. So Christ is superior to the angels. Angels were important in the Jewish law. It was angels that gave the law. According to Deuteronomy 33 and verse 2, we find the word saints, which really means holy ones or angels. But angels were simply messengers of God. They are sometimes called sons of God, but they were never fit objects of human worship. So the passage, verses 4 through 14, begins and ends with the rhetorical question of whether Jesus is superior to the angels. So it starts out in verse 4, that Christ is far better than the angels, not necessarily in moral character, but in rank. This is a statement of fact. In verse 5 and following, he begins to prove that declaration. But here he simply makes the statement that he's far above the angels. And then he quotes some verses to show that he is far above the angels. The first one is, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. And then again, I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. So the question is, as to which of the angels did he say, you are my son? This is a quote from Psalm chapter 2 and verse 7. Now, of course, the answer is, well, that's not said to any angels. Adam's angels and saints are sometimes called sons of God, but this has reference to creation. No individual was ever addressed as the Son of God. And this is another proof of the virgin birth of Christ. Christ was begotten to kingly dignity at his resurrection. Then in 2 Samuel chapter 7 and verse 14, it is stated regarding God, I will be to him a father. Now in this context, it is David who wants to build a temple to God, but you remember that God tells him that his son Solomon will build the house of God. Now these words would have specific reference to David and his descendants, primarily Solomon. But Christ or the Messiah is certainly the antitype. You see, all things in the Old Testament and all phrases would not necessarily have an antitypical reference, but many of them would. But if the Bible tells us it does, it does. But if it doesn't, then we cannot say this is a type of anything else. So here Christ is spoken of again as being the Son of God, and God would be his Father. Then we come to verse 6. And again, he quotes the Old Testament. This is a quote from Deuteronomy 32 and verse 43, taken from the Septuagint translation, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. I might mention here that most of the time, the quotations we find in the New Testament are really quotations from the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. Rarely is a direct quote from the Hebrew Scriptures, which is kind of interesting, I think. But in the next verse, in this verse, they are called angels. If angels worship Christ, then obviously angels are inferior to Christ. The word firstborn means that he was a recipient of special privileges and double inheritance. Again, in Psalm 89 and verse 27, he said, I will make him the firstborn, the highest of the kings of the earth. This shows special honors were bestowed to Christ in relation to his kingship. So the word firstborn refers in honor rather than order of birth. He is the firstborn because he exists before all creation. Now remember, since Christ created everything, then obviously he must have existed before the creation. That means he's the firstborn. But that does not imply that there was a time when he did not exist. You see, that's the mistake that many people make. They take the idea of firstborn indicated that he was the first created being. But that would imply a time when he did not exist. But that is not true. Again, if he's exactly like God, he must be eternal, which means there has never been a time when he did not exist. So therefore, Christ, the word firstborn, only has reference to his dignity, his honor, not the fact that he's simply the first created being. Then we come to verse 7. And this is a quote from Psalm 104 and verse 4, where it talks about angels being God's ministers or servants. They serve God just as the winds and the lightning do. And this likely indicates the swiftness by which angels do his bidding. You see, he's not degrading the angels by pointing out they're simply servants of Christ or God. He's actually exalting them because they are the willing servants of God, and they're swift to do his will. And then we come to verses 8 and 9. These verses contrast what is said of the Son as compared to the angels. These verses contain a quote from Psalm 45, verses 8 and 9. These words could not apply to Solomon because many of the ideas in this passage would not fit Solomon. So this passage is a prophecy of the Messiah, and it declares several things regarding this Messiah. One, it declares his divinity. He talks about God. Oh, your throne, oh God, is forever and forever. Here, God himself called Jesus God. Now, that's a great reference to his divinity, isn't it? When God the Father calls you God, then certainly you must be equal to God. His dominion and his dignity is that of a king. The righteous scepter shows his authority. Then the third thing is his duration of his kingdom. It would be eternal. Again, if God is a God, he's eternal. So if he has a kingdom, then his kingdom must also be eternal. So this kingdom will be an eternal kingdom. This kingdom will be characterized by perfect equity of judgment and righteousness. The word righteousness comes from a Greek root word which means straight. So all of its judgments will be fair and honest and equitable. It will be righteous. And that he was anointed by God for this rule. But he was anointed by God after his resurrection. So Christ then, these verses point out the great characteristics of Jesus in relation to the kingdom of God. And then we come to verses 10 through 12. Again, we find quotations from the Old Testament. So you find this whole first chapter is almost exclusively quotations from the Old Testament. In verses 8 and 9 then, we find a quote from Psalm 102, verses 25 through 27. Christ has the right to rule the world because he made it. Again, this goes back, reminds us of Colossians 1, verse 16, where Paul reminds the readers of Colossae that Christ created the world. The world has changed and is growing old according to scriptures. In the Bible, the world is represented by a curtain or tent, or maybe a book that's growing old. In this passage, it is represented as a garment that is no longer fit for use and will be folded up. The world will be dissolved. It will be replaced. There will be new heavens and a new earth. But in spite of everything that we know of being changed, Christ is the same. Christ is the same. He remains not by escaping death, but by overcoming death. But while Christ will remain the same, the earth in which we live will be replaced like a new set of clothes. It's not simply renovated, but it's made completely new. Then we come to verse 13. To which of the angels has he ever said, "Sit at my right hand"? Again, this is a repeat from what we've just said before, back in verse 4. This is a quotation from Psalm 110 and verse 1. And we have here an argument from silence. Notice the question is asked, to when did he ever say, "Today you will be my son"? Well, the answer is nowhere. He's never made this statement to anyone else. Now, since it's not recorded that he made this statement to anyone else, then that means that Christ is far superior then to everyone and everything else, because it's only been to Christ that God says, you are my son. Now Christ applies Psalm 110 verse 1 to himself in Matthew 22 verse 43 and 44, also Mark 14 verse 26. Peter applies it to Christ in Acts chapter 2 verses 34 and 35. So this passage into Psalm 110 has been referred to a number of times in the New Testament. But again, it refers to the fact that Christ is the only Son of God, indicates his superiority over everyone and everything else. Again, to sit at the right hand of God indicates power, dominion, dignity, and the right to participate in the judgment of God. Now, Christ has enemies, but all of his enemies will one day submit to his authority. They will be made his footstool. Now, to be made a footstool means to be made completely powerless. It was a common figure of speech back in the early days. Back in the days of warfare, the kings would often defeat their enemies. And when they would defeat their enemies, sometimes they put the king and they put their foot on top of his head to show that he has completely overcome this kingdom and his power. Well, that's the imagery here. Yes, Christ has enemies, and we know today that Christ has a number of enemies. But one day, Christ will completely overcome all of his enemies. So therefore, we need to make sure then we are not the enemies of Christ. And now we come to the last verse of chapter 1. Are they not all ministering spirits sent forth to minister for those who will inherit salvation? Angels are called here ministering spirits. This is in contrast to the Christ as Lord or conquering King. You see, Christ is the Son of God. Christ is the all-conquering King. Christ has the eternal kingdom. Christ is talked about as being Lord. But spirits, the angels, they're simply ministering spirits, or they're servants spirits. They can on occasions assume bodies, but that does not increase their dignity necessarily. It just means they're performing their work as being servants of God. But notice who they are to minister to. They are to minister to those who are heirs of salvation, or in other words, Christians. Now, we do not know exactly how they minister to us. I would like to know, and all of us would like to know more about how angels minister to us. You know, in our modern world, there's a lot said about so-called guardian angels. Some people say that my guardian angel is overlooking me. Or when they're protected from some danger, they will say, God's angel was watching over me. Well, we may make statements like that, but there's no proof that we have guardian angels. Matter of fact, most of the evidence indicates that we do not have guardian angels as such, because we know that many bad things happen to Christians all the time. So if we have guardian angels as such, then they're not doing a very good job, are they? No, we do not know what these angels do. Here they're simply spoken of as being ministering spirits to those who will inherit salvation, or in other words, Christians. Exactly what they do, how they do it, we do not know. The Bible does not tell us. Now, the Bible does tell us that angels are interested in our salvation. Luke 15 and verse 10, you remember Jesus said, there will be rejoicing in heaven, and all the angels will rejoice over the repentance of just one soul. The angels carried Lazarus to Abraham's bosom in Luke chapter 16 and verse 22. Christ speaks of angels of little children in Matthew 18 and verse 10. So while angels are mentioned in connection to Christians in those verses, that still does not really answer our questions. We do not know what services they render. We do not know how they render those services. Christ knows what he needs, or what we need rather, and he commands the angels to take care of us, or to give us the things that we need. I think that's all we can say on that. Exactly anything more we could say would be more speculation and opinion than anything else, and we certainly do not want to get involved in those areas. But suffice it to say that much of the modern day fascination with angels, much of the theology in regards to angels in the modern day world are simply created. It is not something you find in the Bible. It's taking a few tidbits of knowledge, so to speak, and expanding it and adding to it. But when you do that, of course, then you have a lot of falsehood and opinions put into it. And we do not need to get involved in doing things like that. So this ends up the first chapter. I might encourage you to read ahead if you can as we discuss the next chapters. But not only that, but think about all the times that you mention something in the Old Testament. Even in this first chapter, I don't know exactly, but there have been 7 or 8 quotations of verses from the Old Testament. You'll find many references in the rest of the book to various events of the history of Israel, people, the priesthood, characteristics of the priesthood, and so on and so forth. This points out the importance of the Old Testament. Without knowledge of the Old Testament, we would have no idea of what the meaning of the book of Hebrews is. So when people say, why study the Old Testament? We are under the New Testament today. Well, this tells us why we need to study the Old Testament. Because without knowledge of the Old Testament, we'll never understand much of the New Testament, particularly the book of Hebrews. So I hope this will be beneficial, and look forward to discussing the rest of the book with you in the next video. Thank you.